Empress Velkara had ruled the Nexus station for over 2 centuries, and in all that time, nothing had ever truly frightened her. She was the matriarch of the Xinthian species, a race of predators that made other aliens cross to the opposite side of corridors when they approached. Standing nearly 10 feet tall with 8 segmented limbs, covered in midnight black chitin that could deflect plasma rounds, she was the living embodiment of apex evolution. Her mandibles could slice through reinforced titanium like it was paper, and her venom could liquefy organic matter in seconds. But on this particular morning, when she entered the royal nursery and found it empty, Empress Velkara knew true fear for the first time in her long life. The nursery was supposed to be the most secure location on the entire station. Triple reinforced walls. Biometric locks that only responded to her genetic signature and those of her most trusted guards. Surveillance systems that monitored every millimeter of space every second of every day. And yet, somehow, impossibly, her 12 spawn was simply gone. Velkara's first reaction was denial. She swept through the nursery with increasing panic, checking every corner, every hiding spot where curious younglings might play. Her spawn were only 3 months old, still in their juvenile phase, but already showing the intelligence and cunning that made Xinthians such formidable beings. Perhaps they were hiding, she told herself. Perhaps this was some elaborate game. But deep in her core, through the psychic bond all Xinthian mothers shared with their offspring, she felt nothing. No playful thoughts. No mischievous glee. Just emptiness where 12 bright, fierce little minds should have been broadcasting their constant stream of consciousness. The head of her guard detail, Commander Thex, arrived within minutes of her emergency summons. He took one look at the empty nursery and his usually stoic expression cracked with horror. In Xinthian culture, the loss of royal spawn wasn't just a tragedy. It was a catastrophe that could destabilize the entire hive's political structure. Lock down everything, Velkara commanded, her psychic voice so forceful that Thex actually stumbled backward. Every corridor. Every docking bay. Every single air vent large enough for a spawn to crawl through. Nobody leaves this station. Nobody moves without my explicit permission. Find my children. Now. Within seconds, alarms shrieked through every level of Nexus station. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut with thunderous booms. Docking clamps engaged on every ship currently berthed, trapping them in place. The station's artificial intelligence began routing all security footage to the central command center, where teams of analysts would scrutinize every frame. The station housed over 15,000 beings from dozens of different species. Traders, diplomats, refugees, travelers, all going about their business when suddenly their world became a prison. Confusion turned to panic as armed Xinthian guards swarmed through the corridors, their mandibles clicking with barely contained aggression, their sensors sweeping for any trace of the missing spawn. Velkara herself joined the search, her massive form moving with surprising speed through the upper decks. She reached out with her psychic abilities, calling to her children, promising safety, begging for any response. Nothing came back but silence. The security footage from the nursery showed nothing unusual. The spawn had been sleeping peacefully at the shift change. The guards had performed their standard checks. Everything normal. Then, in a 2-minute window when the cameras inexplicably glitched, the spawn had vanished. Not a single trace. Not a single clue. Just 12 empty sleeping pods and a mother's worst nightmare. Commander Thex approached with his preliminary report, his antennae drooping with the shame of failure. Empress, we've identified all ships that docked in the past 48 hours. Most are regulars, known quantities. But there's one outlier. A human cargo vessel called the Iron Phoenix. They arrived 18 hours ago requesting emergency repairs to their hyperdrive coolant systems. Humans? Velkara's compound eyes focused with predatory intensity. She knew of humans, of course. Everyone did these days. They were the newest species to achieve interstellar travel, spreading through the galaxy with remarkable speed. Soft-bodied mammals with no natural weapons, no armor, no venom. By all logic, they should have been prey animals, cowering on their homeworld. Instead, they'd somehow clawed their way to the stars through sheer stubborn determination. The Empress had never paid them much attention. They seemed harmless enough. Friendly, even eager to trade and establish diplomatic relations. Their ships were clunky and inefficient compared to Xinthian biotechnology, but they worked. Their crews were polite and followed station regulations. But now, with her spawn missing, every outsider was a suspect. Where is this human ship berthed? Velkara demanded. Lower Deck 7, Maintenance Section. They've been conducting repairs in the industrial zone. The work was authorized by our dock master before the incident. And their crew? Thex's mandibles clicked nervously. 5 humans total. Captain Tommy Brooks, Navigator Lisa Martinez, Cargo Specialist Danny Walsh, Systems Operator Rachel Bennett, and their mechanic, Jake Miller. All are currently confined to their ship under guard, except... Except what? The mechanic, Jake Miller, is not accounted for. According to their captain, he was working in the lower maintenance tunnels when the lockdown engaged. We've been unable to establish contact. The communication systems in that sector are apparently malfunctioning. Velkara felt something cold settle in her chest. The maintenance tunnels. The vast, poorly monitored network of service corridors that ran beneath the station's main levels. The same tunnels that, theoretically, could provide access to restricted areas if someone knew the right routes. "Bring me this Captain Brooks," she said quietly. Now. Jake Miller had been a starship mechanic for 7 years, and in that time, he'd learned one important lesson: always bring your communicator. Always. It was the one rule he drilled into every apprentice, the one safety protocol he never compromised on. Which made it especially ironic that on this particular day, his communicator was sitting uselessly on his workbench back in the Iron Phoenix, 3 levels above him. He'd been elbow-deep in a plasma conduit junction when the station's power grid started acting weird. Fluctuating readings, inconsistent flow patterns, the kind of thing that could cause a cascade failure if left unchecked. The station's automated systems had flagged it as low priority, but Jake knew better. Low-priority problems had a nasty habit of becoming catastrophic ones if you ignored them long enough. So he grabbed his toolkit and headed down into the guts of the station, following the maintenance maps on his datapad. 3 levels down, through corridors that got progressively narrower and less maintained. This was the old section of Nexus Station, built decades before the newer, shinier levels above. Down here, everything was exposed pipes, flickering lights, and the constant hum of machinery that kept 15,000 beings alive in the vacuum of space. Jake had just finished rerouting the conduit when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a mechanical space. Something organic. Something alive. It was a chittering noise, high-pitched and rhythmic, coming from somewhere to his left. He turned, shining his work light toward a narrow access tunnel he hadn't noticed before. The chittering continued, urgent and distressed. His first thought was vermin. Stations this size always had problems with creatures that hitched rides on cargo ships. Space rats, crystal beetles, sometimes worse. But something about this sound made him pause. It wasn't random. There was pattern to it. Almost like communication. "Hello?" Jake called out, feeling slightly ridiculous talking to what was probably just some animal. "Anyone down here?" The chittering stopped abruptly. Then, after a moment of silence, it started again, even more frantic. Something was wrong. Jake couldn't explain how he knew, but every instinct he had was screaming that whatever was making that noise needed help. He set down his toolkit and squeezed into the access tunnel. It was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he had to crawl on his belly, pushing his work light ahead of him. The tunnel curved downward, then opened into a small maintenance junction about the size of a walk-in closet. Jake emerged into the space and swept his light around. 12 pairs of eyes reflected back at him from the darkness. For a moment, Jake's brain simply couldn't process what he was seeing. The creatures clustered in the corner of the junction were like nothing he'd encountered in all his years traveling the galaxy. Each one was roughly the size of a big dog, but that's where any similarity to Earth animals ended. They had 8 legs, segmented bodies covered in dark, glossy armor, and heads that featured multiple eyes and mandibles that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. His first instinct was pure, primal terror. Every survival instinct screamed at him to back away slowly, to get out of this confined space with these clearly dangerous predators. His hand actually moved toward the tunnel entrance before his brain caught up. These creatures were babies. Young ones. He could see it in their movements, the way they huddled together, the size of their heads relative to their bodies. And they weren't being aggressive. They were scared. The chittering started again, and Jake realized it was coming from them. They were calling out, not in attack but in distress. One of the creatures, slightly larger than the others, separated from the group and took a tentative step toward him. Its multiple eyes fixed on his face, and its antennae waved uncertainly in the air. "Hey there," Jake said softly, forcing himself to stay calm even though his heart was hammering. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." The creature took another step closer. Jake held perfectly still, letting it approach at its own pace. When it was close enough, one of its antennae extended and gently touched his outstretched hand. The sensation was impossible to describe. A tingling warmth spread up his arm and into his head, and suddenly Jake wasn't just seeing the creature anymore. He was feeling what it felt. Images and emotions flooded his mind in a jumbled rush. Confusion, fear, hunger, cold, and underneath it all, a desperate, overwhelming need for safety and warmth. They were lost. These babies were lost and scared, and they'd been down here alone for who knew how long. "Oh man," Jake whispered. "You guys are in trouble, aren't you?" The creature made a soft trilling sound, and the others began to emerge from their corner. They approached cautiously, their many legs clicking softly on the metal floor. Soon Jake was surrounded by 12 alien youngsters, all of them pressing close, seeking contact, radiating need. He should have been terrified. Any rational person would be. These things could probably tear him apart if they wanted to. But all Jake could see were frightened kids who needed help. He pulled off his thermal work jacket and spread it on the floor, creating a makeshift nest. The creatures immediately piled onto it, drawn to the residual warmth from his body. Jake sat down next to them and started talking in a low, soothing voice. It didn't matter that they probably couldn't understand English. The tone was what mattered. "You're okay now. I got you. We'll figure this out." One of the braver youngsters climbed partially into his lap, curling its body against his chest. Another rested its head on his thigh. Soon they were all touching him in some way, their chittering gradually shifting from distress to something that sounded almost like purring. It was a strange sound, like metal grinding against metal, but somehow comforting. Jake pulled out his ration bars from his toolkit and broke them into pieces. The creatures devoured them eagerly, their mandibles making quick work of the compressed food. After eating, they seemed to relax even more, their bodies growing heavy with exhaustion. That's when Jake noticed how quiet everything had become. The usual background hum of the station had changed. There were distant alarms, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the decks above, and what might have been weapons charging. Something was very wrong up there. He should probably try to get topside, find out what was happening, report back to Captain Brooks. But when he tried to stand, the creatures panicked. Their chittering became frantic again, and several of them grabbed onto his clothes and limbs with their mandibles. Not biting, not hurting, just holding on desperately. They thought he was leaving. They thought he was abandoning them. Jake settled back down, and the creatures immediately calmed, pressing against him again. He could feel their fear through that strange psychic connection. Whatever was happening upside could wait. These kids needed him right now, and he wasn't about to let them down. "All right," he said quietly, wrapping his arms around the two closest to him. "I'll stay. We'll wait this out together." The creatures purred louder, their bodies radiating warmth. One by one, they began to fall asleep, creating a pile of alien youngsters with Jake at the center. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, one hand gently stroking the armored head of the creature in his lap. Whatever trouble was brewing above, it would have to wait. Right now, 12 scared kids needed someone to keep them safe. And Jake Miller wasn't going anywhere. 3 hours had passed since Jake had found the creatures, and in that time, the world above had apparently descended into complete chaos. The sounds filtering down through the maintenance shafts painted a clear picture: heavy boots stomping in formation, shouted orders in languages Jake didn't recognize, the distinctive whine of energy weapons powering up, and underneath it all, a low vibration that made the metal walls hum. Something big was happening, and none of it sounded good. Jake shifted carefully, trying not to disturb the sleeping pile of alien youngsters draped across him. His left leg had gone numb 20 minutes ago, and his back was complaining loudly about sitting on bare metal for so long. But every time he considered moving, one of the creatures would stir and make a worried chittering sound, so he stayed put. He'd counted them multiple times now. 12 total, ranging in size from about as big as a beagle to nearly the size of a golden retriever. Their exoskeletons were predominantly black, but in the beam of his work light, he could see iridescent patterns rippling across their shells in deep purples and blues. Beautiful, really, once you got past the whole terrifying alien predator thing. The largest one, the first brave enough to approach him, had claimed the spot directly on his lap. Jake had started calling her boss in his head, because she was clearly the leader of this little group. Whenever the others got restless or scared, boss would make a specific clicking sound and they'd settle down. Now she was dead asleep, her head tucked under one of her front legs, occasionally twitching like a dog dreaming of chasing rabbits. Jake found himself smiling despite the situation. Kids were kids, apparently, no matter what planet they came from. His datapad had lost signal hours ago, which wasn't surprising this deep in the station's infrastructure. He tried using it to send a message to Captain Brooks, but nothing went through. The emergency comm channels weren't working either. Whatever was happening topside had knocked out the lower-level communications entirely. He was effectively cut off from the rest of the station. The smart thing would be to leave the creatures here and try to make it back to the ship. Find out what was going on. Report in. Follow protocol. But every time Jake seriously considered it, he'd look down at the 12 sleeping youngsters who'd trusted him enough to let their guard down, and the idea just felt wrong. Besides, they needed him. In the past few hours, he'd learned a lot about them through that weird psychic connection they shared. They were hungry most of the time, though his ration bars had helped. They were cold, despite their thick shells. And they were absolutely terrified of being alone. Whenever Jake had to shift positions or reach for something, any creature that lost contact with him would immediately wake up in a panic. Something bad had happened to them. He didn't know what exactly, but the fear was real and deep. They'd been abandoned or lost, and that trauma was fresh enough that they couldn't bear the thought of it happening again. "I know, little guys," Jake murmured, gently stroking Boss's armored back. "I'm not going anywhere. Promise." Boss made a contented grinding purr sound without opening her eyes. The ration bars were gone now, all 12 packages consumed by hungry alien mouths. Jake had given them the last of his water too, though he wasn't entirely sure if they needed water the same way humans did. They'd drunk it eagerly enough, so he figured it couldn't hurt. That left him with nothing, but he'd been in worse situations. He could go without food and water for a while longer. The temperature in the maintenance junction had dropped noticeably. Jake's breath was starting to fog in the beam of his work light. The station must have diverted power from the lower levels, probably routing everything to security systems and sensors. Great for whoever was running the search operation topside, not so great for anyone stuck in the basement. The creatures had noticed the cold too. They'd pressed even closer together, creating a living pile of warmth. Jake found himself grateful for their body heat. Whatever their biology was based on, they ran hot. Like having 12 living space heaters cuddled up around him. Another hour passed. Jake's stomach growled loudly enough that several of the youngsters stirred and looked at him with concern. He laughed quietly and patted the nearest one. "Don't worry about me. Just my stomach reminding me it exists." The creature tilted its head, mandibles clicking softly. Then, to Jake's surprise, it carefully regurgitated a small portion of processed ration bar and nudged it toward him with its antenna. Jake stared at the offering, genuinely touched. This alien baby was trying to share its food with him. Sure, it was pre-chewed alien baby food, but the gesture hit him right in the chest. "Thanks, buddy, but you keep it. You need it more than me." The creature looked confused for a moment, then consumed the food again and settled back down against his side. The sounds from above were changing. The frantic activity seemed to be intensifying, if that was even possible. Jake heard what sounded like bulkheads being torn open, metal screaming as something incredibly strong ripped through it. Whatever they were searching for, they were getting desperate. A terrible thought occurred to him. What if they were searching for these creatures? What if these youngsters were someone's pets, or worse, someone's property, and Jake was currently sitting in what amounted to a kidnapping situation? He looked down at the 12 sleeping forms piled around him. They'd been alone and terrified when he found them. No parent would leave their kids in a situation like that. And if someone had stolen them, they would have taken them off the station by now, not left them in a maintenance tunnel to starve. No, these kids had gotten lost somehow. Wandered off or escaped from wherever they were supposed to be. And now someone was looking for them. Someone who probably had the authority to tear the station apart to find them. Jake sighed. He was going to have to move eventually. Get these youngsters back to wherever they belonged. But not yet. Not until they'd had enough rest, enough food, enough comfort to face whatever came next. He owed them that much. Boss stirred in his lap and looked up at him with her multiple eyes. Through their connection, Jake felt a question forming. Not in words exactly, but in emotion and intent. She was asking if he was okay. If he was scared. "I'm fine," Jake said softly. "Just worried about you guys. But we're gonna figure this out. Somehow." Boss made that grinding purr sound again and nuzzled against his chest. Then she did something that made Jake's throat tighten. She very gently touched her mandibles to his hand, in what could only be described as a kiss. "Yeah," Jake whispered, blinking back unexpected moisture in his eyes. "I like you guys too." Somewhere above them, something massive was moving through the station. Jake could feel the vibrations through the floor, like footsteps from a giant. Whatever was coming was getting closer. The youngsters felt it too. They began to wake, chittering nervously, pressing closer to Jake. He wrapped his arms around as many as he could reach.
It's okay. I'm here.
Nothing's gonna hurt you while I'm here. He had no idea if he could actually keep that promise. But he'd die trying if he had to. The footsteps were getting louder now. Coming down. Coming closer. Jake held the frightened creatures tighter and waited. The sound of tearing metal echoed through the maintenance tunnels like thunder. Jake felt the youngsters press even closer against him, their chittering rising to a panicked pitch. Whatever was coming had just ripped through a reinforced bulkhead like it was made of cardboard. Boss climbed higher on his chest, her mandibles clicking rapidly near his ear, and Jake could feel waves of pure terror rolling off all 12 creatures through their psychic connection. "Sure, it's okay," he whispered, even though his own heart was hammering hard enough to crack ribs.
I got you.
I got you. The junction suddenly flooded with blinding white light. Jake squinted against the glare, one arm instinctively coming up to shield his eyes while the other stayed wrapped protectively around the youngsters. Through the spots dancing in his vision, he could make out a massive silhouette filling the entrance to the maintenance tunnel. Something big. Something that shouldn't have been able to fit through that space but had made it fit anyway through sheer force. As his eyes adjusted, Jake's breath caught in his throat. The creature blocking the tunnel entrance was easily 10 feet tall, covered in midnight black armor plating that looked thick enough to stop a tank round. 8 segmented legs, each ending in points that had gouged deep scratches into the metal floor. A head that featured more eyes than Jake could count and mandibles that were easily the size of his forearm. This was an adult version of the babies he'd been protecting, and it was absolutely terrifying. The creature's mandibles were spread wide in what Jake's lizard brain recognized as a threat display. The kind of posture that came right before something became lunch. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go, and even if there was, he wouldn't leave the youngsters. So Jake did the only thing he could think of. He put a finger to his lips and made a shushing gesture. "They just fell asleep," he said quietly, surprised his voice wasn't shaking more than it was. Took forever to get them settled down. The massive creature froze. Its mandibles slowly closed, and Jake could swear he saw confusion in those alien eyes. Through the psychic connection he developed with the youngsters, Jake suddenly felt something new. A presence. Vast and ancient and powerful, brushing against his mind like a tidal wave against a sandcastle. Images flooded his consciousness. The youngsters sleeping peacefully. Hours earlier, Jake finding them scared and alone. Him gathering them close, sharing his food, his warmth, his comfort. Every moment of the past few hours played out in his mind from multiple perspectives, and Jake realized he was seeing his own actions through the eyes of the 12 babies. The massive creature was reading their memories. Reading his memories. "You stayed with them." The voice appeared directly in Jake's head, feminine and filled with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Not anger. Something else. Something that made his chest tight. "Yeah," Jake said simply. "They were scared. I couldn't just leave them like that." The creature took a step forward, moving with surprising care to avoid making noise. In the better light, Jake could now see more details. The intricate patterns etched into her armor. The way her posture had shifted from aggressive to something else entirely. The slight trembling in her antennae. "They are my children," the voice in his head said. "My spawn. The heirs to my house. I am Empress Velkara, and when I discovered them missing, The mental voice faltered. "I believed them stolen. Harmed. I was prepared to tear this station apart molecule by molecule to find them." Jake looked down at the sleeping pile of youngsters around him. Royal heirs. He'd been cuddling with alien royalty for the past 4 hours. That explained the massive search operation topside. "They weren't stolen," Jake said. "At least, not by me. I just found them down here, scared and hungry. I figured someone was probably looking for them, but..." He gestured helplessly at the youngsters. "They wouldn't let me leave. Every time I tried, they'd panic." Velkara moved closer, and Jake had to fight the urge to flinch. She was examining her children with what could only be described as a mother's eye, checking each one for injuries. Through the psychic connection, Jake felt her relief washing over them all like a warm wave. "You fed them," the Empress said. "Your rations. All of them. They were hungry. You gave them your water. They were thirsty. You stayed in the cold, without food or water, without communication, isolated from your crew, because my children were afraid." Jake shrugged, feeling suddenly self-conscious. What else was I supposed to do? They're just kids. The Empress went very still. Jake felt something massive happening in her mind, thoughts moving at speeds and in directions he couldn't follow. When she spoke again, her mental voice was quieter. You are human, yes?
Yes'm.
Jake Miller, mechanic off the Iron Phoenix.
I know of your species. Soft. Weak.
No natural weapons.
No armor.
No venom. You should have been prey animals, cowering on your homeworld.
She paused.
Yet here you sit, surrounded by 12 of the most dangerous juvenile predators in this sector, and you call them just kids.
Well, they are, Jake said.
I mean, yeah, they've got the teeth and the armor and everything, but they're still babies. They needed help. One of the youngsters, a medium-sized one Jake had mentally named Trouble, began to wake. She chittered softly, felt Jake's presence, and settled back down without even opening her eyes. The Empress watched this with what Jake would have sworn was astonishment. They trust you completely, Velkara said. In all my years, I have never seen spawn bond so quickly with anyone outside the hive. Especially not with an alien species. Especially not with. She trailed off. With prey? Jake finished for her.
Yeah, I get it.
Probably looks weird from your perspective. Weird, the Empress repeated.
Yes.
That is one word for it. She tilted her massive head. Tell me, Jake Miller. Did you know who they were? Did you know they were royal spawn when you found them?
Honestly? I had no idea what they were.
I just knew they were scared and alone. And if you had known they were dangerous? That they could have killed you? Jake looked down at Boss, who was still fast asleep on his lap, occasionally twitching with dreams. Wouldn't have mattered. They were still just scared kids who needed help. The silence that followed was profound. Through the psychic connection, Jake felt the Empress's mind working through something massive, some conclusion that would have far-reaching consequences he couldn't begin to understand. Finally, Velkara began to carefully extract her spawn from their pile around Jake. She moved with incredible gentleness, lifting each youngster with legs that could have crushed steel. The babies woke slowly, chittering in protest until they sensed their mother's presence. Then they climbed onto her, seeking the comfort of familiar arms. But each one, before leaving, turned back to Jake and touched him with their antennae. A gesture of thanks. Of affection. Of something that transcended species boundaries. Boss was the last to go. She nuzzled against Jake's chest one final time, made that grinding purr sound, and very gently touched her mandibles to his hand again. Then she climbed onto her mother's back and settled in with her siblings. Jake tried to stand and immediately stumbled. His legs had gone completely numb from sitting still for so long. Velkara caught him with one leg before he could fall, steadying him with surprising care.
Thank you, Jake said simply.
For not, tearing me apart when you first got here. I should be thanking you, the Empress replied. You showed my children mercy when you had every reason to fear them. You gave them comfort when you had nothing to give. You stayed when anyone else would have fled. The walk back through the station was surreal. Jake limped along on numb legs while Empress Velkara moved beside him, her 12 spawn clinging to her massive frame like living ornaments. Every few steps, one of the youngsters would peek around their mother's armored body to look at Jake, chittering softly. Boss, perched on the highest spot on Velkara's back, kept her eyes fixed on him the entire time, as if afraid he might disappear. The corridors they passed through were absolute chaos. Maintenance panels hung open where they'd been ripped off. Bulkheads showed massive dents and tears. Entire sections of wall had been peeled back like aluminum foil. Jake realized with a growing sense of awe that the Empress had done all this. One mother, tearing through a space station with her bare hands, searching for her children. So, Jake ventured as they climbed a service ladder to the upper levels, how much trouble am I in exactly? Velkara's mental voice held a note of what might have been amusement. Trouble? You believe you are in trouble? Well, yeah. I mean, your kids went missing and I had them. Can't imagine that looks great from a legal standpoint. Jake Miller, you are perhaps the only being on this station who is not in trouble. The Empress paused at a junction, her antennae twitching as she sensed the path ahead. My security forces, however, will be answering very pointed questions about how 12 royal spawn managed to wander away from a supposedly impenetrable nursery. They emerged into the main corridor of Deck 7, and Jake immediately saw his crew. Captain Brooks was there, along with Lisa, Danny, and Rachel, all looking exhausted and terrified. They were surrounded by a ring of heavily armed Xinthian guards, their weapons powered down but still present. When Brooks saw Jake emerge with the Empress, his weathered face went through about 6 different emotions in 2 seconds.
Jake.
Thank God, we thought. Brooks stopped mid-sentence as he took in the full scene. Jake, covered in alien shed and looking like he'd been through a war. The Empress, carrying 12 youngsters. The way those youngsters kept looking at Jake with obvious affection.
Captain, Jake said tiredly. Sorry about the radio silence.
It's been a weird day.
A weird day, Brooks repeated slowly.
Jake, the entire station has been on lockdown for 6 hours. We've been confined to the ship, questioned by what I'm pretty sure were alien special forces, and told that if you weren't found soon, would all be facing charges for kidnapping royal heirs. And you're calling it a weird day? To be fair, Velkara's voice suddenly echoed in all their minds, making the crew jump. Your mechanic is the only reason my children are alive and well. He found them lost and frightened in the maintenance tunnels and stayed with them, protecting them, when he could have simply walked away. Lisa stepped forward, her navigator's instincts cutting through the shock. So we're not in trouble? On the contrary, the Empress said. You are honored guests. Your ship's repairs will be completed at no charge. You will receive compensation for your distress and lost time. And your mechanic. She turned her massive head to look at Jake. Your mechanic has earned something far more valuable. Before Jake could ask what that meant, Velkara raised one of her legs high in the air. The gesture seemed to be some kind of signal because every Xinthian in the corridor immediately stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. Guards snapped to attention. Station personnel froze mid-step. A silence fell over the deck that was almost religious in its intensity. Then, slowly and deliberately, Empress Velkara bowed. Her massive frame lowered until her head was level with Jake's chest, mandibles spread in what he'd learned was a gesture of respect. The 12 spawn on her back chittered in unison, their own small heads dipping in imitation of their mother. Every other Xinthian in the corridor immediately followed suit. Dozens of armored predators, each one capable of tearing through steel, all bowing to her exhausted human mechanic who just wanted to sit down. Jake stood there, completely frozen, having absolutely no idea what to do with this. Jake Miller. Velkara's voice resonated not just in his head but apparently through every Xinthian mind in range. I declare you friend of the Hive. You are under the protection of House Velkara. Our resources are your resources. Our territories are open to you. Our strength is yours to call upon. This bond is eternal and unbreakable. So it is declared. So it shall be. The other Xinthians repeated the last phrase in their own clicking, chittering language, and Jake felt the weight of something ancient and powerful settling over him like an invisible cloak.
Jake managed intelligently.
Thanks? Boss chose that moment to climb down from her mother's back and scuttle over to Jake. She pressed her armored head against his leg, purring that metallic grinding sound, and looked up at him with all her eyes. Through their connection, Jake felt what she was feeling. Love. Gratitude. A bond that went deeper than species or biology. Jake knelt down and gently stroked her armored head. Take care of yourself, boss. Stay out of trouble. Boss chittered what he somehow knew was a laugh, then rejoined her siblings. One by one, the other 11 youngsters came over to touch him with their antennae, a final goodbye before they returned to their mother. Each touch sent a pulse of affection through his mind, along with something that felt like a promise. We won't forget you. The lockdown lifted within the hour. Station operations returned to normal, though the damage from the Empress's search would take weeks to fully repair. The Iron Phoenix received not just free repairs but upgrades that would have cost a fortune anywhere else. Their cargo holds were filled with trade goods and rare materials, gifts from House Velkara. Captain Brooks spent the entire time looking like someone had hit him over the head with reality. Do you understand what just happened? He asked Jake as they prepared to depart. You've been adopted into an alien royal house. Do you have any idea how unprecedented this is? I just helped some scared kids, Jake said for what felt like the 100th time. You created a diplomatic alliance through the power of babysitting, Rachel chimed in from the navigation console. The government is going to lose their minds when we report this. If we report this, Brooks muttered. I'm still not sure anyone would believe us. As the Iron Phoenix pulled away from Nexus Station, Jake stood at the observation window and looked back. In one of the station's massive viewports, he could see 12 small shapes pressed against the glass, their antennae waving in what he'd learned was the Xinthian equivalent of waving goodbye. He waved back, smiling. 20 years later, when Velkara's spawn had grown into adults and taken their places as leaders throughout the Xinthian hive, the Human-Xinthian alliance would be the strongest in the known galaxy. Trade routes that had been closed for centuries opened up. Technology was shared. Cultural exchanges flourished. Other species watched in amazement as humanity and one of the galaxy's most feared predator species became not just allies, but friends. Historians would spend decades analyzing how it happened. They'd write papers about the political climate, the economic factors, the strategic advantages that made the alliance inevitable. But those who were there, who saw it firsthand, knew the truth. It started with a mechanic who found 12 scared kids in a maintenance tunnel and decided to stay with them, because that's what decent people do. Because sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs don't happen in conference rooms or through treaties. Sometimes they happen in the dark, when someone chooses compassion over fear. And sometimes, just sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can change the entire galaxy. Jake never did get his thermal jacket back. Boss kept it, even after she'd grown large enough to wear it as a hat. She claimed it was a family heirloom. Jake figured that was fair. After all, she'd given him something much more valuable in return, the knowledge that no matter how different we might look on the outside, scared kids are still scared kids, and they all need someone to tell them it's going to be okay. Even if that someone is just a mechanic with a big heart and an empty stomach, sitting in a cold maintenance tunnel, surrounded by 12 of the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. Especially then. Retriclord can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.